Hey guys, I'm Ted, here to give you another fast fact, and for this fast fact, we are going to discuss Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow is the official term for American segregation. That is segregation that was practiced in the United States, uh, and it rose primarily in the 1880s, and it developed from the unspoken customs that sort of fell into place at the end of Reconstruction, and these customs were by large based on the black codes and the slave codes of the of the period of American slavery, of American chattel slavery, between 1619 and 1865. These unspoken customs normally involve the deference of all African Americans towards European Americans, regardless of social class or status. The underlying principle between the slave codes and the black codes was that African Americans were to, in all public basis and all aspects of life, really just show deference and subservience towards European Americans. And with the end of the slavery and so forth, there was this new sort of boldness amongst African Americans, in which they took to heart the writings or the philosophies of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, that they were the equals of their former of people who saw themselves as their betters. It sort of goes to illustrate exactly why the Redeemers were so violent, why they were so intent, so impassioned upon overthrowing Reconstruction. Reconstruction brought about inequality between the two ethnicities in the South, African Americans and European Americans, that the Redeemers just could not countenance. They could not fathom a world in which they did not have privileges based on their ethnicity. So and so it was that these customs came into being, and at first these new laws merely divided public spaces by ethnicity, but they soon began to prohibit African American from public participation totally. At the same time, these unspoken policies were becoming laws. New laws were being passed, and these laws were aimed at voters, particularly at disenfranchising African American voters. Now, the two most prominent were the poll tax and the literacy test. The poll tax involved paying a tax before you were allowed to vote, and of course, the literacy test involved proving that you were able to read, that you were able to comprehend the voting acts and so forth, and what was being voted on. Illiteracy was widespread in the South, and so in order to illiteracy and poverty was widespread in the South. So, and to enable European Americans to vote, understanding clauses were included in the literacy test, in which the local board, who were all European Americans, would judge for themselves whether someone who failed the literacy test understood what was being asked of them in voting. And they almost always found that African Americans were not, they did not understand what they were voting for, but they always found that European Americans knew what they were voting for. Likewise, the poll tax. Poverty and debt was also widespread in the South, but in order to allow this to continue without any major hiccups, poor redeemers were simply not charged the poll tax in many areas, and many European American inclusive areas they weren't charged, and in other areas they simply had the tax paid for by a wealthy neighbor or by a friend on their behalf. Now, where the poll tax and the literacy test failed, Redeemer governments introduced what's known as the grandfather clause. Now, the grandfather clause was an ironclad way to eliminate African Americans from voting. What it did was, what it stipulated was that if your grandfather had not voted in 1860, then you were disqualified from voting. And this was a law designed specifically to target African Americans. since the only segment of the population who could not vote in 1860 were slaves. And the majority of the African American population was descended from the freedmen, the men who had been freed by the 13th Amendment. So it effectively disenfranchised them. Now, Jim Crow segregation, or United States segregation, American segregation, was instituted purely for racist motives. The driving fear behind the institution of Jim Crow segregation was that African Americans born after slavery would not show the deference. They would not be appliant. Had those who had been born before 1865, they would not show the any deference. They would not have any understanding of the black codes or the slave codes. So they would be less inclined to simply to simply be subservient or to simply accept any sort of inferior status. And Jim Crow was a way of reinforcing that, was a way of reinforcing ethnic superiority. And there you guys have it. That's my quick, fast fact on Jim Crow. A lot more can be said on Jim Crow. This is not even the tip of the iceberg on Jim Crow. It is mainly some essentials on early Jim Crow. But as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this. And as always, I'm Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another Fast Fact.